The structure rose 40 feet into the air above the cornfields of rural Nebraska, a chaotic, twisting skeleton of rusted iron, reclaimed sheet metal, and repurposed automotive parts that seemed to defy every aesthetic code of the county. To the residents of Blackwood, a town where the horizon stretched flat and endless and conformity was a survival mechanism, the tower was not an innovation. It was an eyesore. It was a blemish on the pristine agricultural landscape. It was the frantic, delusional project of a man who had clearly spent too much time alone in his machine shed. Marcus Henderson stood at the base of his creation, wiping grease from his cracked knuckles with a rag that had long ago lost its original color, looking up at the monstrosity he had birthed from the scrap heap. The wind, the relentless, howling force that battered the plains from October to March, whistled through the gaps in the metal, creating a low, mournful hum that the neighbors had already begun to complain about. They called it Henderson's Folly. They called it the junk spire, but Marcus just called it the solution it was impossible to miss. If you drove down County Road 9, past the endless rows of soy and the silos that gleamed silver in the sun, your eye would inevitably catch the glint of the mismatched blades. They weren't the sleek, white fiberglass blades of the commercial turbines that dotted the hills in the next county over. These were ugly. They were rough. They were cut from 55-gallon oil drums, bisected and welded onto a central vertical axis that looked suspiciously like the rear axle of a heavy-duty pickup truck. The entire apparatus sat atop a trellis tower constructed not from high-grade steel beams, but from old radio antenna sections and reinforced with angle iron scavenged from demolished barns. To the casual observer, it looked like a stiff breeze would bring the whole thing crashing down onto Marcus's farmhouse roof, and the locals made sure to tell him exactly that every chance they got. The mockery didn't happen in hushed tones. It was loud, public, and good-natured in that biting way that rural communities specialize in. It happened at the feed store on Saturday mornings. Clyde Miller, a cattleman who had farmed the same 3,000 acres since the Nixon administration, was the loudest of the critics. He would lean against the counter, adjusting his cap, and ask Marcus if he was trying to communicate with aliens or just trying to lower the property values for everyone else. Clyde would laugh, a deep, raspy sound, and tell the other farmers that Marcus was building the world's largest scarecrow. He said that electricity comes from the pole, plain and simple, and that trying to catch the wind with trash was like trying to catch rain with a sieve. The others would nod, chuckling into their coffee cups. They saw Marcus as a tragic figure, a man who had let his retirement turn into an obsession with garbage. They didn't see the geometry. They didn't see the gear ratios. They saw a pile of junk, but Marcus Henderson heard something different when they laughed. He heard the complacency of men who had never had the lights go out for long enough to truly be afraid. He was 62 years old, a man who had spent the first half of his life as a mechanical engineer for a manufacturing plant in Detroit before the industry shifted and he moved back to the land his grandfather had owned. He wasn't a farmer by trade, but he was a homesteader by spirit. He possessed a mind that couldn't look at a problem without taking it apart to see how the gears meshed. And the problem, as he saw it, was dependency. He looked at his neighbors, good people who worked themselves to the bone, and saw how tethered they were to systems they couldn't control. They were at the mercy of the grid, at the mercy of the propane delivery truck, at the mercy of a supply chain that was growing more brittle by the year. The motivation for the tower had been born 3 years prior, during a winter that had shattered records and pipes alike. An ice storm had swept down from the Dakotas, snapping power lines like dry twigs. For 8 days, Blackwood had been dark. The silence of the furnace stopping was a sound Marcus would never forget. He remembered the feeling of the temperature inside the house dropping, degree by agonizing degree, until he could see his breath in the living room. He remembered huddling under for layers of wool blankets, watching the food in the freezer thaw and spoil hundreds of dollars of meat, the fruit of a season's labor, turning to mush. He remembered the helpless look in his neighbor's eyes when the generator fuel ran out and the gas stations couldn't pump because they had no power either. That week, Marcus had made a vow to himself. He swore that he would never again be cold because a line went down 50 miles away. He swore that his farm would stand on its own 2 feet, even if he had to build the legs out of scrap iron. The research phase had been solitary and intense. Marcus didn't have the budget for a $60,000 solar array or a commercial wind turbine setup. His pension was modest, and the farm barely broke even most years. If he was going to do this, he had to do it with what he had, what he could find, and what he could fix. He spent nights poring over old engineering manuals and obscure internet forums where off-grid enthusiasts shared blueprints for low RPM alternators. He studied the designs of the Savonius and Darius wind turbines, vertical axis machines that didn't need to be pointed into the wind to work. They were robust, they could handle turbulent air, and most importantly, they could be built without high-tech composites. He sketched diagrams on the back of seed catalogs. He calculated torque loads and wind shear. He filled notebook after notebook with the math of survival. Then came the scavenging. For 6 months, Marcus became a phantom of the local junkyards and scrap heaps. He wasn't looking for just anything. He was hunting for specific mechanical organs that could be transplanted into his beast. He found the heart of his machine in a rusted-out 1998 Dodge Ram, the rear differential. It was heavy, built to withstand immense torque, and perfect for transferring the slow, powerful rotation of the wind blades into a faster spin for a generator. He pulled the alternator from a semi-truck, a massive unit capable of putting out high amperage. He scoured the recycling center for materials to build the blades. He needed surface area, something that would catch the lightest breeze but stand up to a gale. He found his answer in the industrial sector blue plastic 55-gallon drums that had once held detergent. They were aerodynamic when cut, lightweight, and virtually indestructible. The construction process was a testament to stubbornness. Marcus worked alone, using a block and tackle system rigged to his tractor to hoist the heavy components. He poured the concrete foundation himself, mixing bag after bag of cement until his back screamed in protest. He dug the trench for the heavy-gauge copper wire that would run from the tower to the battery bank in the barn. The battery bank itself was another marvel of reuse. He couldn't afford a Tesla Powerwall or a bank of new lithium-ion batteries. Instead, he had negotiated with a forklift repair shop 3 towns over. He bought dead forklift batteries, massive lead-acid units that weighed as much as a small car for scrap price. He knew that often, these batteries could be reconditioned, the sulfation cleared off the plates with the right chemical treatment and a slow pulse charge. It took him 2 months of dangerous, meticulous work with acid and distilled water, but he brought them back to life. He built a massive storage capacity that looked like a science experiment gone wrong, bubbling and humming in the corner of his barn. When the tower finally began to rise, the town's amusement turned to concern. Sarah, who ran the post office and knew everyone's business before they did, stopped by one afternoon. She leaned out of her mail truck, looking up at the metal skeletons swaying slightly in the breeze. She told Marcus that people were talking. They were worried it was unsafe. They were worried it would attract lightning. They were worried he was losing his mind. She asked him gently if he had considered just buying a backup generator like a normal person. Marcus wiped his hands on his jeans and looked her in the eye. He told her that a generator eats gas and gas runs out. The wind, he said, pointing to the swaying wheat, doesn't run out? Sarah just shook her head and drove off, leaving a trail of dust and doubt. But Marcus kept building. The day he hoisted the rotor assembly was the hardest. The wind was gusting at 20 miles per hour, making the heavy metal awkward and dangerous to handle. He had to wait for a lull, his heart pounding in his chest, knowing that one slip could crush him or destroy months of work. He aligned the truck axle with the mounting plate, bolting it down with grade 8 hardware he had specially ordered. He attached the split drum blades, bolting them to the frame with hundreds of washers and lock nuts. When he stepped back, the thing looked prehistoric. It was rough, industrial, and undeniably ugly. But then, a gust of wind caught the blue curves of the drums. There was a groan of metal, a settling sound, and then silence. The massive rotor began to turn. It didn't spin like a pinwheel. It rotated with a slow, deliberate power. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. The rear differential spun, the drive shaft turned, and down at the base of the tower, the belt drive engaged the alternator. Marcus rushed to the control box he had wired up in the barn. He watched the needle on the voltmeter. It flickered. It jumped. It held steady at 28 volts. He watched the amperage gauge climb. 10 amps, 20 amps, 30 amps. He felt a lump form in his throat. It was working. The junk pile was breathing electricity. For the next few months, Marcus lived in a state of constant tweaking and refinement. The system was far from perfect. The initial vibration was enough to rattle his teeth when he stood near the base, so he had to fabricate rubber dampeners from old tires to isolate the tower from the ground. The belt drive slipped when the wind really kicked up, screeching like a banshee, so he designed a spring-loaded tensioner using parts from a garage door opener. He learned the language of his machine. He knew that a certain pitch of the hum meant the wind speed was exceeding 30 miles per hour, and he needed to engage the mechanical drum brake system left intact on the truck axle to prevent the turbine from spinning itself to destruction. He ran the wires into his house, connecting them to an inverter that turned the DC battery power into AC household current. The first time he flipped the main breaker at the utility box, cutting his house off from the grid, his hands shook. The house went dark for a second, then the inverter hummed and the lights flickered back on. He walked to the refrigerator and listened. The compressor kicked in. He turned on the television. It worked. He went to the kitchen and made a pot of coffee using electricity harvested from the air above his cornfield. It was the best cup of coffee he had ever tasted. But outside, the meter on the utility pole stood still. The neighbors, however, remained unimpressed. They saw the spinning drums and heard the low-frequency thrumming, and they rolled their eyes. At the diner, the jokes continued. They asked Marcus if he was going to fly away in his house like in the movies. They asked if he was printing his own money yet. When Marcus tried to explain the data that he had been paid an electric bill in 3 months, that his batteries were fully charged by noon every day, they dismissed it. Clyde Miller waved a hand and said, "Wait until winter, Marcus. Wait until the ice comes. That heap of rust will freeze solid or snap in half. You can't outsmart the weather with garbage." They were comfortable in their skepticism. They were secure in the knowledge that the way they had always done things was the only way. They trusted the poles. They trusted the wires. They trusted the bill that came in the mail every month. Winter came early that year, and it came with a vengeance. The warnings started in late November. The meteorologists were using words like historic and catastrophic. A polar vortex was descending, a mass of freezing air that would plunge the Midwest into temperatures not seen in a generation. The forecast called for wind chills of 40 below zero and ice accumulation of up to an inch. In town, there was a run on bread and milk. People were filling gas cans and checking their propane tanks. But there was an underlying assumption that, like always, it would be inconvenient but manageable. The trucks would salt the roads. The power crews would be on standby. The system would hold. Marcus spent the days before the storm prepping the farm, but his routine was different this year. He didn't worry about fuel for a generator. He checked the guy wires on his tower. He greased the bearings on the main shaft with cold weather synthetic lubricant. He checked the specific gravity of the battery acid in his massive storage bank. The bank was fully charged, holding enough power to run his house for 4 days even if the wind stopped completely. But the wind wasn't going to stop. The forecast called for sustained winds of 30 to 40 miles per hour. For Marcus, the storm wasn't just a threat. It was fuel. The storm hit on a Tuesday evening. It started with rain, cold and heavy, that froze the instant it touched the ground. The world turned into glass. Trees bowed under the weight of the ice, their branches groaning and snapping with sounds like gunshots. Then came the wind. It screamed across the flatlands, driving the ice like shrapnel. Inside his house, Marcus sat by the window, watching the chaos. He could hear the turbine spinning in the dark, a steady, rhythmic pulse against the howling gale. The vibration through the ground was stronger tonight, a testament to the sheer power the machine was absorbing. He glanced at his monitor panel. The batteries were in float mode, completely full. The dumpload, a massive resistive heating element he had installed in his water heater, was active, diverting the excess energy to heat his water so the turbine wouldn't overspeed. He was warm. He had light. He had hot water. 3 miles away, at Clyde Miller's place, the lights flickered once, twice, and then died. Clyde cursed and fumbled for a flashlight. He looked out the window and saw the darkness stretching all the way to the horizon. The entire county had gone black. He wrapped his coat tighter around himself and went to the garage to start the generator. It fired up with a roar, and the lights in the kitchen came back on. Clyde smirked. He was prepared. He had 10 gallons of gas. That would last him 2 days. The power would be back by then. It always was. But the power didn't come back. The ice had done catastrophic damage. Transmission towers had buckled under the weight. Miles of lines were on the ground. The utility company issued a statement saying that repairs could take weeks, not days. The roads were impassable, sheets of black ice that sent utility trucks sliding into ditches. By the 3rd day, the temperature had dropped to 12 degrees below zero. The silence over the countryside was deafening, broken only by the sporadic sputtering of generators running low on fuel. At Marcus's farm, the lights were blazing. The heat pump, powered by the relentless wind, kept the house at a comfortable 68 degrees. He cooked hot meals on his electric range. He took hot showers, but he didn't gloat. He watched the road, waiting. He knew what was happening out there. He knew the physics of cold houses and dying fires. On the 4th morning, he saw the first truck creeping slowly down his long, icy driveway. It was Clyde Miller. Clyde didn't look like the confident cattleman who held court at the feed store. He looked old. His face was gray with cold, and he was trembling. He knocked on Marcus's door, his hat in his hands. When Marcus opened the door, a blast of warm air hit Clyde in the face, and the man almost wept. "Marcus," Clyde stammered, his voice cracking. "My generator died. I'm out of gas. The roads are too bad to get to town, and even if I could, the station pumps are off. My wife... she's freezing. The house is 30 degrees inside." He looked past Marcus into the warm, lit living room, and then he looked up toward the barn, where the ugly, scrap metal windmill was churning away, slicing through the biting wind. "How?" Clyde asked, a whisper of defeat. "How do you still have power?" Marcus didn't lecture him. He didn't say, "I told you so." He didn't bring up the jokes or the mockery. He just stepped back and opened the door wider. "Bring her here, Clyde," Marcus said quietly. "Bring anyone else who needs help. The coffee is hot and the batteries are full." Within 6 hours, Marcus's farmhouse had become a sanctuary. 3 families from the neighboring properties were huddled in his living room. They slept on mattresses dragged onto the floor. They charged their phones to call relatives. They ate soup heated on his stove. Outside, the wind continued to howl, a terrifying force that was stripping the roofs off barns and freezing livestock in the fields. But here, that same terrifying force was being transmuted into survival. The neighbors watched the monitor on the wall, mesmerizing in its simplicity. They saw the numbers fluctuating: wind speed, voltage, amperage. They watched as the ugly, rusted machine outside turned the storm against itself. Sarah from the post office was there, wrapping her hands around a mug of tea. She looked at Marcus, who was sitting in his armchair reading a book by the light of a lamp that shouldn't have been working. "We laughed at you," she said, her voice small. "We called it a pile of junk." "It is a pile of junk," Marcus agreed, smiling faintly. "But it's junk that understands the wind." The crisis lasted for 11 days, 11 days of sub-zero temperatures and isolation. During that time, Marcus's system didn't just keep the lights on. It became the heartbeat of the immediate community. He ran an extension cord to his well pump, filling containers for neighbors whose pipes had frozen. He used his workshop tools to fix a broken heater for the Miller family. He showed the men how the system worked, taking them out to the base of the tower during a lull in the storm. They stared up at the truck axle spinning silently, the plastic barrels capturing the energy. They touched the cold metal of the tower, no longer seeing an eyesore, but seeing a miracle of engineering. They asked questions about gear ratios and battery chemistry. They asked where he found the parts. The mockery had evaporated, replaced by a profound, hungry curiosity. They realized that while they had been buying comfort, Marcus had been building security. The morning the storm finally broke, the sky turned a bruised, pale purple, the clouds thinning just enough to let a watery, impotent sun bleed through. The temperature hovered at 0, but the wind, the relentless engine of their misery and Marcus's salvation, finally began to die down. It didn't stop, but it settled into a steady, manageable breeze of 10 miles per hour. Inside the Henderson farmhouse, the silence that followed the ceasing of the gale was jarring. For nearly 2 weeks, the house had been filled with the sounds of survival, the murmur of anxious voices, the clinking of silverware, the hiss of the tea kettle, and the ever-present, low-frequency vibration of the turbine transferring power into the floorboards. Now, as the neighbors stepped out onto the porch, blinking in the harsh light reflected off the ice, they saw a world transformed. The landscape was devastated. Old oak trees that had stood since the Dust Bowl were shattered, their limbs scattered like broken bones across the white fields. The utility poles along the main road were snapped in half, the lines buried under drifts of snow and ice. It looked like a war zone, a testament to nature's indifference. But then they turned their heads and looked at the junk spire. It was coated in a thin sheen of rime ice, sparkling like diamonds, but it was intact. The rubber dampeners Marcus had cut from old tractor tires had absorbed the violent shuddering of the gale. The truck axle, built to haul thousands of pounds of payload over rough asphalt, hadn't flinched at the wind load. The plastic drums, flexible and forgiving, had shed the ice as they spun. It stood tall, a defiant, ugly, beautiful finger raised against the sky. Clyde Miller walked out to his truck, which was buried up to the door handles in a snowdrift. He didn't try to start it. He just leaned against the cold metal and looked back at the house that had kept him alive. He looked at Marcus, who was standing by the wood shed, calmly splitting logs for the next season, not because he needed the heat, but because the rhythm of the work settled his mind. Clyde walked over, his boots crunching loudly on the frozen crust. He stood there for a long moment, watching the axe rise and fall, the wood splitting with a clean, sharp crack. "I need to know," Clyde said, his voice rough. "Not the general idea, not the theory. I need to know exactly how you did the coupling. How you got the RPMs from that slow axle to speed up enough for the alternator. I watched it for 10 days, Marcus. I watched that needle on your wall. That's not luck, that's math." Marcus rested the axe on the chopping block. He looked at Clyde, really looked at him, and saw that the mockery was gone. In its place was the terrifying realization of vulnerability. Clyde had seen the abyss. He had seen how thin the veneer of his modern life actually was. He realized that his 3,000 acres, his massive combine harvesters, and his satellite-guided planting systems were useless without the Jews to run them. He was a man who prided himself on independence, yet he had been reduced to a refugee in his own zip code because a wire snapped. "Come to the barn," Marcus said. The next 3 hours were not a social visit, they were a seminar. Marcus cleared off his workbench, pushing aside cans of grease and scattered washers to lay out the schematics he had drawn years ago. He didn't dumb it down. He spoke to Clyde and the 2 other neighbors who had followed them, Jim, a younger soy farmer, and Elias, a retired mechanic, as equals. He explained the gear reduction ratio of the Dodge Ram differential. He grabbed a piece of chalk and drew the math on the concrete floor. "The wind gives you torque, not speed," Marcus explained, pointing to the diagram. "The barrels catch the air and push, it's a slow push. Maybe 60 RPM on a windy day, but an alternator needs 1,000 RPM to start making real power. That's where the differential comes in, you run it in reverse." You spin the axle shafts and the drive shaft spins 4 times faster. Then you use a large pulley on the drive shaft and a small pulley on the alternator. It's a multiplier. Force into speed, speed into electrons. He walked them over to the battery bank. The smell of sulfur and ozone hung heavy in the air, the scent of stored energy. He showed them the desulfator he had built from a circuit board diagram he found in a 1980s electronics magazine. He explained that batteries don't die, they just get coated in crystals. He showed them how he washed the lead plates. He showed them the thick 2/0 welding cable he used to connect the cells salvaged from a defunct shipyard. He wasn't showing them products, he was showing them processes. He was showing them that the waste of the world was full of potential if you had the eyes to see it and the patience to extract it. Jim ran his hand over the casing of the main generator motor. "But the grid is coming back," he said, though he sounded unsure. "The crews are out. We'll have power by tomorrow. Maybe." "The grid always comes back," Marcus said, wiping his hands on a rag. "Until it doesn't, and even when it's on, who owns it? You pay them for the privilege of renting their electricity. You pay them to deliver it. And when they fail to deliver it, you pay the price in frozen pipes and spoiled meat. This," he gestured to the spinning shaft, "this is mine. The wind doesn't send a bill. The wind doesn't have a CEO. It just blows." The restoration of power to Blackwood took another week. When the lights finally flickered back on in Clyde's house, he didn't feel the relief he expected. He felt a nagging anxiety. He walked around his home, turning on switches, hearing the hum of the refrigerator, but it felt temporary. It felt borrowed. The trust was broken. The psychological shift that had occurred during the blizzard didn't melt away with the ice. The community had changed. They had seen the alternative. They had seen the man they mocked living like a king while they froze, and they knew, deep in their bones, that the old insults wouldn't work anymore. You can't mock a man who saved your life. You can't mock a system that works when everything else fails. The spring that followed was wet and muddy, the fields turning into a quagmire that delayed planting season. Usually, the farmers would gather at the diner to complain about the rain and the commodity prices. But this year, the conversation was different. It happened in low voices at the hardware store. It happened in the parking lot of the Tractor Supply. They were talking about Marcus, they were talking about scrap metal. They were talking about independence. It started with Clyde. In late April, a flatbed truck pulled up to Marcus's driveway. Clyde hopped out, looking sheepish but determined. In the back of the truck lay the rusted carcass of a 1995 Ford F-150 rear end, a stack of steel pipes, and 6 blue plastic barrels that smelled faintly of car wash soap. "I can't weld like you can," Clyde said, kicking the dirt. "And I don't know the first thing about wiring a dump load controller. But I've got the parts, and I've got a welder in the shop who owes me a favor. I want to build one. Not exactly like yours, I want it bigger. I've got a hill on the north pasture that catches wind from the valley. I want to put it there." Marcus didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He just nodded, walked to the back of the truck, and inspected the differential. "The ring gear in these Fords is tough," Marcus said, running a finger over the rusted housing. "It'll hold. But you'll need to seal the breather tube better than the factory did, or the rain will get in and turn your gear oil to milk. And those pipes ... they're Schedule 40. Good for plumbing, bad for towers. We need to reinforce them. We." The word hung in the air between them. It wasn't "you need to." It was "we need to." That summer, the construction of Clyde's tower became a community event. It wasn't a solitary obsession like Marcus's had been. It was a barn-raising for the post-industrial age. Men who had spent their lives driving $50,000 tractors were now learning how to cut oil drums with a jigsaw to create the perfect airfoil shape. They were learning about aerodynamics and drag coefficients. Marcus directed the operation, not as a foreman, but as a teacher. He showed them how to balance the rotor assembly using simple gravity, ensuring it wouldn't wobble and tear itself apart. He taught them the importance of the furrow system, the tail vane mechanism that would turn the turbine out of the wind if it got too strong, a mechanical survival instinct. When Clyde's turbine finally went up, it was refined. It was sleeker. They had painted the metal with rust-inhibiting black paint. They had used uniform bolts. It still looked like a piece of Mad Max machinery, but it had a certain brutal elegance. When they released the brake and the blades caught the summer breeze, the silence of the group was heavy. It began to spin. The voltmeter on Clyde's truck dashboard, hooked up to the test leads, jumped. 12 volts, 24 volts. "It's free," Clyde whispered, watching the blades slice the air. "It's actually free." But the validation didn't stop at Clyde's farm. The story of the Blackwood windmills began to leak out of the county. A local newspaper reporter, hungry for a feel-good story after the brutal winter, came out and interviewed Marcus. She took photos of the tower, of the battery bank, of Marcus's rough, grease-stained hands. The article ran on the Sunday front page with the headline, "The Junk Whisperer: How One Man's Trash Saved a Neighborhood." The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Letters started arriving in Marcus's mailbox, not bills, but requests. People from neighboring counties, people from the city, people who felt the same gnawing instability that Marcus had felt years ago. They wanted plans, they wanted instructions. Some offered money, asking if he could build one for them. Marcus read the letters at his kitchen table, the light from his wine-powered lamp casting long shadows. He realized that he had accidentally started a movement. He could have capitalized on it. He could have patented the specific coupling mechanism he designed. He could have started a company, Henderson Renewables, and sold kits for $5,000 a pop. He could have become rich, but he didn't. Marcus sat down at his typewriter. He didn't own a computer and began to type. He typed out the entire process. He listed every part number. He drew diagrams of the cuts for the barrels. He explained the battery chemistry in plain English. He detailed the mistakes he had made, the burnt-out stators, the snapped belts, the wobble that almost brought the first tower down so that others wouldn't make them. He photocopied the document at the library, a thick, 40-page manifesto of scrap tech engineering. He didn't sell it. He put a stack of them in the feed store by the register. He put a stack in the library. When people wrote to him, he mailed them a copy for the cost of postage. The cover page read, "Power from the Pile. A Guide to Independence, no copyright. Copy this, build this, improve this." By the following autumn, the landscape of the county had begun to change visually. Driving down County Road 9 was no longer a journey through a uniform sea of corn and soy. Now, emerging from the tree lines and standing behind the barns, you could see them. There were 5 of them now. Some were painted red, some green. One, built by the high school shop class, was painted in the school colors, blue and gold. They weren't identical. The shop class had used a rear axle from a Chevy, which required a different mounting bracket. They had 3D printed the nose cone for the rotor, improving the aerodynamics. Elias, the mechanic, had figured out a way to use an old washing machine motor instead of a truck alternator, rewiring the coils to produce power at lower RPMs, making the system even more efficient in light winds. Marcus visited every site. He inspected the welds. He checked the guy wires, but mostly, he listened. He listened to the shop students explaining how they had calculated the swept area of the blades. He listened to Elias explaining his new motor rewiring technique. The student was becoming the master, and the master was becoming the archivist. The knowledge wasn't static, it was evolving. It was open-source hardware developed by people who had never heard the term open source. The validation was complete not when the lights stayed on, but when the fear turned off. The winter of that year was cold, though not as severe as the blizzard of the previous year. But when the wind howled, the people of Blackwood didn't look at the power lines with dread. They looked at their meters. They checked their batteries. They felt a sense of agency that had been stolen from them by decades of convenience. They were no longer consumers at the end of a line. They were producers at the source. However, the rapid proliferation of the towers brought a new challenge, one that Marcus hadn't anticipated: the bureaucracy. The county zoning board sent Marcus a letter. It was a cease and desist order. They cited code violations. They cited aesthetic degradation. They cited safety concerns regarding non-permitted structures. They scheduled a public hearing for the second Tuesday of November. The letter threatened fines. It threatened demolition orders. It was the system pushing back, the rigid, codified world trying to crush the organic, chaotic growth of the innovation. Marcus put on his only suit, a charcoal gray number that smelled of mothballs and cedar, and drove to the town hall. He expected a fight. He expected to stand alone at the podium while men in suits lectured him about setbacks and engineering stamps. He brought his binder of calculations. He brought his safety logs. He was ready to go down fighting for the right to build his own future. When he arrived at the town hall, the parking lot was full. Trucks were parked on the grass. People were spilling out of the double doors. Marcus squeezed his way inside, his heart hammering against his ribs. The room was packed. It wasn't just the farmers who had built the towers. It was the families who had sheltered in his living room. It was the shop teacher and his students. It was the librarian. It was Sarah from the post office. The head of the zoning board banged his gavel, looking annoyed at the turnout. "We are here to discuss the unauthorized structures on the Henderson, Miller, and various other properties," he announced. "These structures are in violation of County Ordinance 4-12 regarding residential accessory structures and height restrictions." Before Marcus could step forward, Clyde Miller stood up. He didn't ask for permission. He just stood up, his bulk taking up a lot of space in the aisle. "These ain't accessory structures," Clyde boomed, "and they ain't unauthorized. They're farm equipment, essential farm equipment. Just like a grain silo, just like a water tower. You don't permit a tractor, do you?" "Mr. Miller, please sit down," the chairman said. "The code is clear. The code is dead," shouted a woman from the back. It was the mother of a family who had stayed with Marcus. "The code didn't keep my baby warm when the lines went down." Marcus did. That tower did. The room erupted. It wasn't a riot. It was a testimony. One by one, they stood up. The high school physics teacher stood up and spoke about the educational value, about how his students were learning more from building windmills than from textbooks. Elias stood up and talked about the resilience of the local grid, about how distributing power generation made the whole town safer. They spoke of the aesthetics not as an eyesore, but as a symbol of pride. They argued that the rust was better than the darkness. Marcus stood in the back, silent. He realized that he didn't need to defend his creation. The creation had defended itself by becoming essential. The community wasn't defending a machine, they were defending their new identity. They were defending the feeling of looking at a storm and not being afraid. The board was overwhelmed. They tabled the motion. They appointed a committee to review and update the zoning ordinances to accommodate small-scale renewable energy structures. It was a bureaucratic surrender. They knew they couldn't tear them down. There were too many of them, and the people loved them too much. As Marcus walked out of the town hall that night, the wind was picking up. He looked up at the sky, clear and cold, filled with stars. He drove home, the headlights of his truck cutting through the darkness. When he turned into his driveway, he saw it. The silhouette of the tower against the stars, the blades were spinning, a dark blur. He parked the truck and just sat there for a moment, listening. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. It was the sound of a legacy beginning. But the true legacy wasn't the metal, it was the mindset. He had planted a seed of defiance in the soil of conformity, and it was blooming wild and uncontrollable. Years passed, the towers became a defining feature of the region. They appeared in travel guides as a curiosity. The Windmill Valley. Engineering students from the state university started making field trips to Blackwood to study the designs. They analyzed the efficiency of the split drum blades and were shocked to find that for low-wind environments, Marcus's scrap design actually outperformed some commercial turbines that cost 20 times as much. The Henderson design became a term in the niche world of appropriate technology. Marcus grew older. His hair turned completely white, matching the snow that still fell every winter. He moved a little slower. The climb up the tower maintenance ladder took him longer than it used to. But he kept building. He shifted his focus from wind to other systems. He built a solar water heating system using old radiator panels painted black. He built a methane digester that turned Calminer into cooking gas. He turned his farm into a living laboratory of circular economics. One afternoon, a young woman arrived at the farm. She was carrying a backpack and looked like she had traveled a long way. She introduced herself as Maya. She was from a small village in the mountains of Peru. She spoke good English, but with a heavy accent. She told Marcus that she had found a translated copy of his manifesto, Power from the Pile, in a hostel in Lima. "We have wind," Maya said. "We have old oil drums. We have old trucks that do not run. But we do not have electricity. The government says it is too expensive to run the lines to our village. I want to build this, but I need to see it. I need to understand the ... She struggled for the word, ... the heart of the machine. Marcus smiled, the lines around his eyes deepening. He saw himself in her. He saw the same hunger to solve the puzzle, the same refusal to accept the dark. He motioned toward the barn. "Put your bag down, Maya. We have work to do." He spent 6 weeks teaching her. He didn't just teach her how to build the Henderson design, he taught her how to adapt it. He taught her that at high altitudes, the air is thinner, so she would need larger blades to catch the same amount of energy. He taught her how to source parts in a place where American pickup trucks might not be common. They worked side by side, the old American farmer and the young Peruvian engineer, speaking the universal language of torque, voltage, and resistance. When Maya left, she carried with her not just the knowledge, but the philosophy. She went back to the Andes and built a wind turbine using parts from a derelict mining conveyor belt and plastic water tanks. It worked, and then she taught her neighbor. And her neighbor taught his cousin in the next valley. Marcus Henderson never met the people in that Peruvian village. He never saw the light bulb turn on in a hut that had only ever known candlelight. He never heard the cheers of the children when the first movie was projected onto a sheet hung on a clay wall, powered by the wind sweeping down from the glaciers, but he knew it was happening. He felt it. Every time the wind blew across his Nebraska cornfields, he felt the connection to a global web of scavengers and tinkerers, a silent brotherhood of the independent. 10 years after the Great Blizzard, Marcus passed away in his sleep. He was 75. The funeral was the largest Blackwood had ever seen. They buried him in the small cemetery on the hill, overlooking the valley. There was no religious symbol on his headstone. Instead, Clyde Miller and the other farmers had commissioned a local metal worker to create a small, bronze replica of the split-drum turbine. It was mounted on the granite, free to spin in the breeze. The epitaph was simple, chosen from a line in his own manifesto, Marcus Henderson. He did not wait for the light. He built it, but the story didn't end in the graveyard. The legacy of the scrap windmill was that it ceased to be Marcus's invention. It belonged to everyone. It belonged to the farmer in Idaho who used the design to power his irrigation pumps. It belonged to the mechanic in Senegal who adapted it to pump water from a deep well. It belonged to the commune in Vermont that built a massive version to power their sawmill. The technology evolved. People figured out how to use stepper motors from broken printers to make tiny versions that could charge cell phones. They figured out how to use car alternators in series to create higher voltage systems for running power tools. The Henderson turbine became a genre of engineering, a testament to the idea that high-tech problems do not always require high-tech solutions. Sometimes they just require a rear axle and a refusal to give up. One winter, 20 years after the first tower went up, a massive ice storm threatened the region again. The forecast was grim. The news anchors warned of power outages that could last for weeks. The governor declared a state of emergency. In the cities, there was panic. People fought over batteries in the aisles of supermarkets. But in Blackwood, there was no panic. There was a quiet preparation. People went out to their barns and checked the grease fittings on their towers. They checked the fluid levels in their batteries. They looked up at the gray sky not with fear, but with a grim respect. When the storm hit and the main transmission lines inevitably failed, the valley did not go dark. If you stood on the ridge overlooking the county that night, you would have seen something miraculous. The surrounding counties were black voids swallowed by the storm. But Blackwood was a constellation of lights, hundreds of homesteads glowing warmly in the freezing dark. Each point of light was a testament to a choice to reject dependency, a choice to learn the physics of their own survival. And high above the Henderson farm, now run by a young couple who had bought the place and preserved the original tower as a historical landmark, the old machine continued to spin. It was rusted, squeaky, and ugly, but it turned. It turned through the ice. It turned through the dark. It turned, and it kept the lights on.